fantastic. Thank you so much for being such a great crowd. We promise we're going to have a great show, and then we're going to go home, and then we're going to hear the thunderstorms while we're all home. That's what I arranged with the powers that be. My name's Jamie Fiocco, and my husband Michael and I were the founders and owners of Flyleaf Books, and we're so much. We're so excited to be bringing together writers and readers on a large scale again. We'd love to, we do. We thank our customers who have been our lifeline during the past 2 wacky years. Many thanks also to our brave, smart, capable staff for their dedication, including events and marketing manager Maggie Robe and events coordinator Morel Brizial, who planned tonight's event. They're out in the front. They checked you in and sold you books. Thank you so much for supporting local businesses and cultural centers. You really do shape your community with how you decide to spend your money. And the Art Center and Flyleaf Books are great examples of a community that really gets this. So thank you, and thank yourself as well. A few housekeeping notes before we start. We would like to thank Mark Betker and the other folks at the Art Center for their help. They've been wonderful in setting up this event and allowing us to have a bigger space than what we would have done at the bookstore. Tonight's event will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel with our other Flyleaf events. Give us a couple days, but we'll have it up there. We will hear Frank and Molly talk and conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll leave time for another 30 minutes worth of question and answer. We'll have 2 people on either side of the stage facilitating those questions. We'll repeat them back into the mic, so bear with us as we get the questions asked and answered. At the conclusion of the talk, Frank will sign books at the table at the front of the stage. Just give us a moment to set that up, and thank you. Your books are not signed, but we have signed books that are already signed at the table. In fact, we have more copies of The Beauty of Dusk that are at the outside table, as well as a few of Frank's other previous books. And thank you, finally, for silencing your phones or any gadget that might make noise during our talk. Our conversation partner tonight is Molly Worthen, who teaches you history at UNC with a focus on North American religion and politics. Her last book, called Apostles of Reason, was about the intellectual backstory of the rise of the Christian right. And she recently published an audiobook called Charismatic Leaders Who Remade America that starts with the Puritans and ends with Oprah and Donald Trump. Molly is also a freelance journalist and writes about religion, politics, and higher education for the New York Times and other publications. And Frank Bruni. Frank has been a prominent journalist for more than 3 decades, including more than 25 years at the New York Times, the last 10 of them as a nationally renowned op-ed columnist who appeared frequently as a television commentator. Frank was also a White House correspondent for the Times, its Rome bureau chief, and for 5 years, its chief restaurant critic. He is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books. In July 2021, Frank became a full professor at Duke University, teaching media-oriented classes in the School of Public Policy. He continues to write his popular weekly newsletter for the Times and to produce occasional essays as one of the newspaper's official contributing opinion writers. Thank you, Frank, for sharing your story with us tonight. And please welcome Frank Bruni and Molly Worthen.
To everyone at the Art Center and Flyleaf for putting this together, and I'm so excited to have a monopoly on the microphone for half an hour, and I promise not to waste it on your behalf. I love this book. I just so appreciated how it is both vividly, really personal, but also manages to make so many broad points that feel that they really apply to a load of different situations that people face. And I think to start us off, I'd love for you to just tell us about that morning when you woke up and your vision wasn't quite right.
Sure. First of all, I want to thank you so much for being here with me tonight. I'm an enormous fan of Molly's, and I was timid to ask you, and I'm so glad you're here, and thank you for sharing this night with me. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Flyleaf, for organizing this. October 2017 one Saturday morning I woke up and I could immediately tell something was wrong. There was a kind of fog over the right side of my field of vision. And at first I thought maybe it was some gunk that had gotten into my eye at night. Then I thought, later on when I was at my computer, I just haven't cleaned my glasses properly. Then I thought maybe I had too much wine last night, because that sometimes happens. And as the day went on, and it didn't go away, and I cleaned my glasses and I took a shower, I realized something might be a little wrong, but I still thought in that kind of boomer invincible way, I'll go to the eye doctor in a day or two, and they'll give me a pill, or they'll give me eye calisthenics. It'll all be fine. In short order, I saw one eye doctor who said this looks more serious than something I can deal with. Then I saw a neuro-ophthalmologist, the first of several, a specialty I didn't even know existed. And I learned that I had had a kind of stroke that affected the optic nerve behind my right eye. And I was told in rather short order, rapidly, that it would almost certainly never get better, that there was no treatment. And then the real capper, the first doctor said there was a 40% chance it would happen in my left eye at some point in the coming years. Turns out the conventional medical wisdom on that is more like 20%. But it was a lot to take in that first week. And that's the sort of beginning of the beauty of DUSK and the beginning of my journey.
So we'll try to get into some of the specific byways and where learning about this condition and coming to terms with it took you, as well as the big picture lessons you're still, I think, processing. I think there's a passage early in the book that we talked about earlier that seems to really lay out the big questions that you grapple with here, and I wondered if you could read that on page 23.
I would be delighted to. I just got to, I'm not the most dexterous person in the world, so let's see if I can open this. Okay. Strangely, I began to feel more alive, more attuned, more appreciative. Did that make me a sort of cliche? You bet. And you should brace yourself for a boatload of cliches and jump ship if they're going to bother you. They shouldn't, because a small part of what I came to appreciate was that cliches are cliches, pervasive, enduring, axiomatic, for a reason. They're kissing cousins with verities, down-market analogs of insights. When you're given lemons, you can indeed make lemonade, and that was a big part of my education, which included the confirmation that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, that clouds have silver linings, and that the night is darkest before dawn, although my story isn't about dawn. It's about dusk. It's about those first real inklings that the day isn't forever and that light inexorably fades. It's about a rising and then peaking consciousness that you're on borrowed and finite time. It's about a shifting temperature and altered ambience. And it's about how paradoxical, enriching, and beautiful that dusk can be. My world blurred, but it also sharpened. I held my breath, I exhaled. I said hello to new worries, I said goodbye to old ones. A clever friend of mine summed up my status wittily and well. When one eye closes, another opens.
I really appreciate the way you confront both the usefulness but also the hazards of cliches. And it seems like one reason people often object to cliches, or they might have their guard up when they hear one, is that they have a way of making reality both simpler and rosier than it really is. And I wondered if you could talk about how you discern, in going through the past few years and writing about it, the distinction between positive thinking that's empowering and useful and a survival skill, and magical thinking that is a false path that gives us an illusion of control, that maybe inclines us to not honor our own suffering and not honor other people's suffering. How do you walk that line?
No, it's a great question. How do you stay positive without going into Pollyanna, right? Magical thinking would have been saying, no matter what the doctors are saying, my eye's just going to heal. Magical thinking would have been going into either of the two experimental drug trials that I qualified for, and being certain that they were going to heal me. Positive thinking is going into those drug trials and saying, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm taking some charge. I'm being assertive rather than passive, and that has its own merit, and that has its own value as a coping mechanism. I don't ever for a moment think I'm glad this happened to me. But I can appreciate that in many ways it's made me a better person because it's forced me to think about things and acknowledge things and reach out to other people and see other people in a new way. And I think it's possible to have gratitude for all of those things without saying, hey, this is all upside and no downside. There's a lot of downside. I have to be more careful when I read. I was nervous reading that. I read more slowly. I write more slowly and with more typos than I ever did in the past. But I can think about that, I can focus on that, or I can say, hey, I'm still writing because I still have editors who want to read my words. I'm nervous reading this on the stage, but there are people who came out and seem to find value in me reading it. I choose to emphasize that.
It's clear in this book that you really, maybe just out of instinct, you fall into your vocation as a reporter. And you almost immediately turn this outward and write about, thinking about this unexpected and uncertain tragedy as a source of fascination, as something that you want to learn about, both in terms of how it affects yourself and also as a bridge toward learning about all kinds of dimensions of it and medical trials and other people's experiences. Could you talk a little bit about how you turned this into a source of fascination and a new opportunity for analysis and the kinds of reporting adventures that this launched for you?
Yeah, well, I think part of it was, and this is one of the many ways in which I've been blessed in this, or in which I'm blessed, period. I mean, part of it was instinctive. I have made my living as a journalist and a reporter, so it seemed only natural, and it was intuitive to lapse into journalism reporter mode. And probably the apotheosis of that was I actually I wangled a free trip to Greece from my editors because, I'm really proud of the ingenuity of this. The second, I was in 2 drug trials. The first one, there were very different sorts of theories of the case, very different medicines. The first one was a series of 3 injections into the right eye. And yeah, I know, nice. The second one, a year later, which I also qualified for, was 6 months of twice-weekly injections that you administer to yourself, but in the thigh or the stomach. So that almost felt like a vacation after the and I was really proud at how good I got at filling the needle. I mean, I'm someone who can barely tie his own tie, and the fact that I could inject myself in 30 seconds by the end of it was a source of great pride. It turns out what I was injecting was a compound derived from mastic, from the resin of the mastic tree in a particular area of a particular island in Greece. So I said to my editor, shouldn't I do a column on and I wrote a whole long column on going to meet the trees that might heal me, which just conveniently happened to be in Greece, and it's in the book too.
You sort of tricked the universe, right? You thought you'd given me this terrible thing, I'm going to turn it into a all expenses paid vacation.
When God gives you mastic, make lemonade.
You also, this also was a bridge to meeting some incredible people. You write about so many people in the book. Who are some of your favorites?
I was fortunate to be able to reach out to and gather interviews from and write portraits of these people in the book. And the book is like half about me, but as you know, like half not about me, and about all these people around us who have so much wisdom for us, people who've been through extraordinary struggles, and we know that about them, but we never ask them about it, and I decided I was going to do that. But one of the people I think who captivated me the most was someone I met afresh through this, not a friend that I went to and said, hey, I've never asked you about this, that, or the other, will you talk about it? I had a friend who was clerking for Judge David Taylor, who was on the DC District Court, if I get the title wrong, but it's the court in Washington, DC that's just a tick below the Supreme Court, and it's probably the main feeder court to the Supreme Court. So we're talking high-level jurist, Judge David Taylor. And when this happened to me, a friend of mine said, you should really meet my boss, Judge David Taylor. He's been blind since he was in his early 30s. And now he was in his 70s and is one of the country's most distinguished jurists and had a completely full life. He'd had his kids after he went blind, all of that. And I went and I met him and I talked to him and I got to know him. We became friends. I would go back to DC occasionally. I would have dinner with Judge David Tatel and his wife Edie, who's lovely. And maybe the third or fourth time I was with him, we chatted in his chambers. And then he said, okay, let's go home. And I said, do you want me to call an Uber? And he said, no, we're going to take the Metro. And I'm like, well, the Metro's 8 blocks from his chambers. Like, am I going to be leading him there? No, he had over the years, and he's such a perfect example of how adaptable we all are and of how kind of nimble our brains are, how they can take in information in new ways and almost really rewire themselves. But he knew from practice and from following auditory cues, he could get from the courthouse 8 blocks to the nearest Metro. There needed to be someone with him as a fail-safe, and I was playing that role that evening, that afternoon. But he knew where to cross the street from his memory of steps. He knew when it was safe from various auditory cues. We walked to the Metro, we walked into the Metro, we walked to the platform. I was just ornamental. I was just beside him, and he was doing it all on his own and leading me, if anything. And I remember so distinctly, we sat on the train, and I don't know why he said it at that moment, but he turned to me and he said, Frank, starfish can regrow limbs, and that's nothing compared to what people can do. And he had just shown me that. And I think it's one of the most important messages I got, lessons I learned, and if people take one thing away from this book, I hope it is that sentiment. Starfish can regrow limbs, but it's nothing compared to what people can do.
I appreciate, though, that as much as you devote so much space in the book to celebrating just that, our resilience, you're very careful to not sugarcoat anything. And a lot of the book is also about confronting suffering.
Yeah.
So I have some questions about empathy and honesty. And before I ask them, I wondered if you could say a little bit about what maybe I'll call your sandwich board proposal in the book. What is that?
So I have a chapter of the book called The Sandwich Board Theory of Life. And when the Times ran an excerpt a week and a half ago, it came from that chapter. And I realized early on that one of the greatest risks here, one of the greatest traps, when you're told you're never going to see out of your right eye again, when you're told you might go blind, is to just kind of tumble into self-pity. And I realized at the same time that one way to avoid that was to take a much more accurate and truthful look at, survey of the people around you. If you're really honest about it and you really kind of confront what you know about people or suspect about them, almost everyone in your immediate orbit, almost everybody in the circle after that, is the alumnus or alumna of great suffering or hardship, or is going through really difficult stuff at that time. And we forget it because most of these struggles, most of the pain we carry, most of our scars are invisible. And so I thought to myself, and it's what I read about in that chapter, if we all walked around for a few days wearing sandwich boards that just listed what the hardest things we were going through right then, or the things we had just been through, each of us would find it much harder to be seized by envy. Each of us would be much less prone to self-pity. And I think all of us would be called more quickly and robustly to empathy. But it's because we can't see it and we make a set of envious and too rosy assumptions about the people around us who seem to be on glide paths. Or in that chapter I write about that span of days a couple of years ago when Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade both committed suicide. Now, those were two people, two public figures who in different ways probably caused millions of people to say, I wish I had his life. I wish I had her life. That's because you didn't understand his life. You didn't understand her life. And when we make those sorts of assumptions, we end up, I think, in self-pitying, envious places that are not reflective of the truth of life.
I see the power of that, but it makes me wonder, how do you keep that exercise from turning into what some people call a kind of tragedy Olympics? Like, my terrible thing is clearly worse than your terrible thing. You get sort of perverse one-upmanship. I mean, what's the right mental posture to avoid that hazard?
Yeah, because you're not doing it as a competition or a ranking. I hear you. The oppression Olympics in our society can be very wearying and counterproductive. But you're not doing it as like, okay, I've got it better than her, and a little bit worse than him. You're doing it as a way of realizing that kind of struggle and some degree of intermittent pain are the default human setting. I mean, they're our sort of homepage, And so it's not about ranking and comparison, it's about recognizing the reality of being alive and all the dimensions of being alive, including the really challenging ones.
Maybe there's some value in always prefacing an effort to acknowledge someone else's suffering with simply, I have no idea what you're going through. And then going on to sort of try, but prefacing it that way. This connects to something I've been thinking about a lot, which is the way in which the idea of empathy, the notion that we can, in some visceral way that is more than just a rational exercise, put ourselves in someone else's position and imagine what their life is like. And this idea has become fairly controversial among philosophers, among political activists. It's seen as, potentially just an act of egoism by the person who's trying to do it, and maybe a dangerous way of attempting to make moral decisions, because we tend to empathize with people who are more similar to us in various ways. It's not rational by definition. What do you make of that empathy skepticism? The idea that it can be a real act of hubris to try to engage in it?
I think it gets another one of those things that I think boils down to nuance, right? I think it can be an act of hubris to say, I can imagine exactly what you're going through. I can identify with exactly what you're going through. You can't, but you can identify with the fact that the person is struggling, in a broader, vaguer sense. You can identify with struggle. And so I think it is arrogant and assumptive to assume you understand someone's condition in great detail and to a specific fine point. But the fact that the two of you are bridged by hardship in different forms, the fact that the two of you are bridged by struggle in different forms, that doesn't seem to me like an act of hubris at all. That seems to me like an act of humanity.
Does this prompt you to go into empathetic reporter mode? I mean, it seems like that's a powerful and productive way of channeling your desire to connect with another person, rather than maybe declaring, oh, you must feel this way, or this reminds me of the terrible thing that happened to me. Rather, using your impulse to frame a question rather than an attempt to characterize.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what you're describing is an approach that has an adequate measure of humility, and I think that's really, really important. I do feel humbler than ever before in ways I can't really fully explain or expound upon, but I think it connects to what you're saying.
Your book got me thinking a lot about the resources that we all have when something terrible happens in our lives, and I'm wondering, did you notice a difference between people you encountered who were connected in some way to a traditional religious community, had a traditional set of metaphysics of whatever tradition, and people who were more secular? Did you yourself at times wish that you had a more traditional Catholic worldview to rely on?
I didn't, because that's just not something that's ever been in me or has felt right to me. And I think because I'm not a person who is involved in organized religion or any kind of classic religion like that, I don't think I kind of noticed who was religious and who was not in that sense. But I think I definitely noticed who was connected to a value system and not. I mean, at the end of the day, what is a religion but it is a value system, and it is a sort of set of instructions for living. I think you can have that sort of North Star, that sort of center of gravity to just wildly throw out astral and geographic metaphors or whatever, but I think you can have that without a dogma, without a creed per se, but you can have it as a matter of your own morality, and I think that does help people and is important. Then I also think that almost every religion has prompts for reflection and encouragements of reflection, most often called prayer. I found myself talking to myself in a way I never had before. I found myself kind of sitting quietly with my thoughts in a way I never had before. And I recognized at some point that I was, in my own secular way, praying. And I've always understood people who were religious. I've always respected people who were religious. And I think I understood it better then. But for me, it still wasn't a religion. It was a sort of habit of mind, habit of spirit.
Religious communities also provide tools for navigating the arc of human life and coping with aging, coping with death, grappling in a way that is not so inclined to turn away from the truth with mortality. Are secular people not as good at this? Are they more inclined to run away?
I think it depends on the secular person. Yeah, I would not say as a generalization they're not as good at it. But again, I think you do need to have a capacity for reflection that some people have trouble finding maybe without religion. I don't. I know many people who don't. I think you do need to have a set of values. I think you do need to have an appreciation of mortality, which you just mentioned. I think you can have those things without theism. Is theism a word?
Oh, it's a word.
Thank you. This is how bad I am at religious stuff. I didn't even know theism.
You need to
I
some of
know.
my
See,
classes.
now I'm going to show my prejudice. I know theocracy is a word.
So that's interesting. I want to push you on this question of confronting mortality. I do some reporting myself, and I think I often do it, I don't know, to distract myself, to turn an internal fear to the outside. Did you ever wonder whether you were, in reporting, pouring yourself into this work, you were not confronting, the long arc. You were distracting yourself.
You give me credit for being much more philosophical than I am. I'm curious, I'm gossipy, I like to know things other people don't know. Those are the engines of my reporting. I'm really clear on the limits of my soulfulness.
Well, I think that's a great point to open it up to questions from the audience. Let's ask Frank about his gossip.
Oh, now we can actually see it. It was so dark, I thought, maybe it's a laugh track.
All right, any questions? We'll try and get everyone who has a question. It's always no questions and then the floodgates open. So
If you have a question, raise your hand and we can help repeat it.
Yes.
So you can hear it. So up here. Okay.
we have one here, and then we'll go to the other side.
Over here. Yep.
We're not wireless, so we're going to get our steps in today, Maggie and I.
If you feel comfortable speaking your question, I can repeat it on the mic. I don't think we're the only ones that want to know the answer to this question. Carolina or Duke?
The question is simply put, Carolina.
Oh, I heard the question. Well, until recently, my answer to this was I am Switzerland. But then Switzerland got involved in the Russia-Ukraine thing. So now is Costa Rica still in the middle of it? I love both. I am part Blue Devil, part Tar Heel. My wireless network, this is not made up, my wireless network in my home is called Devil Heel. And that's my answer.
You please exactly know
But I didn't please anybody, but I'll get out of here alive.
Maggie?
Can you talk about your transition from New York City to where you live now, with both yourself and, more importantly, Reagan?
So if you don't mind, I'll repeat it so everyone, talk about your transition from New York City to here, and more importantly, Reagan.
Well, my friend Maureen Dowd insists that I moved here for Regan. Sometimes I think maybe she's right. Regan's my dog, and I am ridiculously blessed at being able to include pictures of her every other or third week in my newsletter. And at first it was a total indulgence, but now if she's not there for 3 weeks, I'm flooded with reader emails saying, did something happen to Regan? Believe me, nothing's going to happen to Regan on my watch. I had been wanting for a while, before this happened to me, I'd been wanting to have a change of pace at some point in the near future. I told myself I'd wanted to move out of New York City where I've been living too continuously for too long. I'd wanted something greener and gentler, and yes, for me, not just for Regan. And when this happened, the answer to your question is all kind of related. when this happened, I did say to myself, you never know what's coming down the road. You know, I mean, I don't know whether my left eye is going to hang in there for eternity or whether I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and it will have winked out like my right eye. And although that's not about mortality, it is about realizing that things that you put off, you may not be able to experience in the way you want to experience them in the present. And so I wanted something like this, and I just did it sooner than I would have if I hadn't been through the medical odyssey that I was. And I love being here. Regan and I walk probably about 8 miles a day, totaling 2 hours. I know the trails and the woods around my neighborhood better than many of my neighbors who lived there 30 years, and they would tell you this, I'm not bragging. And it's just a real privilege, and it's a reconnection. You know, I get such ridiculous pleasure from just being in the woods when the right kind of breeze is on my face, from watching Regan chase squirrels and deer and seeing her run and the joy in her stride. And these are just such simple but wonderful things that too many of us let zip by without really relishing them. And I don't do that anymore. And this area has it's connected me with some of that stuff in a way that I wasn't before.
I apologize for calling the dog Reagan.
No, it's okay. There's a lot of debate in my family about whether she's Reagan. So she was my little brother's dog. I kind of absconded with her. He used to call her Reagan, but the spelling of her name was inconsistent in various places, and the fact that it was often spelled R-E-G-A-N, I thought gave me license to repronounce it. And I just feel very strongly, a theme of my writing is often that we've got to get past partisanship and polarization. So along those lines, I do not believe in a dog that's named after a president. So I will never have a dog named Obama or Reagan or Clinton, certainly not Trump.
We have a question here. I was just wondering, did you intentionally make the font larger in the book so it would be more easy to read?
Did you intentionally make the font larger in the book so it would be easier to read?
Well, I didn't know it was that large. Is it that large? Or?
It's larger, yeah, I think it's larger than.
Yeah, no, I had nothing to do. There's all this stuff that we don't, that they don't give authors much say on. They do let you see cover designs and sometimes reject cover designs. And this one they originally wanted to be white. I insisted on blue, and that was simply because my 3 previous hardcovers all had white covers, and I'm like, this has to end at some point. It was my idea to make the DUSK salmon colored like that, which I'm very proud of. But they don't consult you on font size or a lot of other things like that, and I wasn't aware that it was larger than. I do know that they're not doing a large print edition of the book, at least as of yet, and that bums me out because there are people there are vision impaired people who've emailed me and asked me about that. But there's an audio version. I read the whole thing myself, and it's been very satisfying to hear already from a lot of people who've listened to the audio version because they are people who are vision impaired and who consume their books that way.
I'll get you next. We're going to go back and forth.
You've been the beneficiary of some wonderful medical care. What has this experience done to sensitize you to the lack of medical access in America?
Well, I mean, it's done the obvious thing. I mean, when I think about how scary this could be at times for me, even with access to great care, I certainly thought, and what if I didn't have that access? What would this feel like then? And it would be horrible. But I want to say something, and I can't, to your point about empathy, I can't really speak to what it would be like to go through this without that access because I don't have that access. I can speak to the fact that that no one should have to. And I do find it shameful in this country that we haven't worked harder to solve this riddle of the uninsured and of people who do not have basic medical care. But I want to add something to that, though. That's what I can speak to as someone who did have insurance, who did have access to good care. Even with access to good care, and I say this not as, oh, we have troubles too. I say this because it's a lesson I have to share with people. Even with access to good care, I was sometimes steered in the wrong directions. I was sometimes not asked questions that I should have been asked. I write about this in the book, and I've talked about this quite a bit over the last week because I want people to hear it and to be improved, for lack of a better word, by it. But I was in these clinical trials because of that, because of other stuff. Over the span of 2 to 3 years, easily more than a dozen medical professionals, most of them doctors, but some doctors' assistants, interacted extensively with me. And I was someone, whose eyes were central to what he did for a living, reading, writing, whatever. And not a single one of those people ever said to me at any point, how are you doing emotionally and psychologically with this? Have you considered counseling? Can we give you a referral? They were all specialists looking at me through a very narrow, predetermined lens. And I share that because I think it's all too common that we go to doctors and we immediately adopt a passive posture and we kind of attribute to them godlike powers and knowledge, and we just kind of nod and defer and do what we're told. And while it's vitally important to venerate expertise to the right measure, it's equally important to be a full partner in your healthcare. It's equally important to realize that your doctor is only going to be as good as the questions that you take into that office and into that meeting. And it's really important to realize that the only one who's really looking at the whole of you is you. And so you cannot, even if you are among the blessed as I am, to have access to good medical care, you cannot leave it there. You still have to be a full participant in your medical care to get the care, to get the kind of care you ideally want to have. And I hope everyone knows that, especially as we age, we should know that.
It seemed like the dehumanization was not just in the way specialists kind of silo different parts of your experience and focus on what they know, but also just the Kafkaesque bureaucratic maze that you were stuck in for, and I guess probably will always, to some extent, be stuck in.
Yeah, no, and I had one really upsetting experience. I mean, now I look back and I'm like, why was I upset about it? But think about, you're in the first couple of weeks of this, you've been told erroneously at the start that there's a 40% chance you'll go blind. And the same doctor who told me that, who by the way got a lot else right, and I remain more thankful for her than not, she said to me, I don't believe there's anything you can for sure do to prevent the other eye from going. But you want to be careful about thin oxygen situations. You want to be careful about avoiding sudden drops in blood pressure. And she said, so I have all my patients fly with oxygen. Now this had to have been a hyperbolic grand statement because you'll see what happens. And I said, what do you mean fly with oxygen? She said, well, when you take a flight, because oxygen can be thin on planes, because cabin pressure can drop, I want you to fly with oxygen. And I'm like, fly with oxygen? I had this vision of myself as this sort of scuba diver on a plane. And, and my heart started racing, and I said, well, how am I going to get this on? And she said, oh, it's easy. I just write you a note, and when you make your reservation, you email or share the note with the airline. And the first flight I had coming up was on Southwest, and I called them and I said, I had this ticket, but now I have this doctor's note, and you need to give me oxygen. And they were like, what are you talking about? And then I thought, Southwest, bargain airline. So my next flight was on Delta, and I went through the whole thing, and they said, what are you talking about? And my heart is racing, because somebody, and this is, I think, classic Dr. Arrogance, somebody has cavalierly told me, I'm going to give you this note, and this is what's going to happen. And when it didn't happen, I felt so scared and infantilized and powerless. And I think probably everyone who's been through a major medical event like me has some version of that story. And it's a shame, because you should not go through something like that when you're at your most vulnerable.
Over here. I just wanted to ask, when you talk about this event and then your acceptance of it, was there a period of anger and resentment? And if there was, how did you get out of it? Was it one or gradually sort of religious, or was it more so?
How did you work through your emotions after this event?
Yeah, so, and I heard you say anger. weirdly, I didn't go through anger, but I would say like my first Kubler-Ross stage was melodrama, which I'm really good at, right? So, you know, I decided, wow, this is really freaky and scary, and so I'm going to go through my Rolodex and call everyone and tell them about it and get a lot of sympathy. And I remember telling my sister, like jokingly but not, that she was going to have to give me, I didn't have Regan at the time, and I told her she was going to have to give me one of her flat-coated retrievers to be retrained as a seeing eye dog. And I remember texting my friend Jennifer and saying, I've got to finally finish Middlemarch because I'm not doing it in Braille. You know, and I sort of had a kind of combination melodrama farce phase. I never ended up in anger because what became pretty clear to me right at the start was that I did not want a diminished life. And I wanted to keep doing all the things I was doing, and I thought if I let myself fall into a hole, the longer I dwell in that hole, and anger is such a hole, self-pity is such a hole, the longer I dwell in that hole and the deeper it gets, the harder it's going to be to climb out. And at some point, I'm going to have to climb out, because I'm not spending the rest of my life like that. And so I just thought the sooner I get around to adapting, the sooner I get around to showing myself all that I can still do, the sooner I get around to this thing that doctors somewhat correctly promised, which was that my brain would start editing my right eye out of the equation, you know, especially if I kept reading, kept writing, whatever. The sooner I got to all of that, the better I'd be in the long run. And my long run, I was clear, was going to be as functional as could be. And so I didn't want to put unnecessary hurdles in front of that or delay that and make it harder.
You're now a professor at Duke. What specific topics do you go over with your students? How have you found teaching? And what do you want your students to take away from your interactions with them?
Yeah, when you say you're now a professor, that still like sounds surreal to me. Like, I know what a bumbling, disheveled wreck I am, so the idea that I'm imparting knowledge to others is terrifying. I find teaching humbling. I think people who don't do it don't have adequate respect for how complicated it is and how hard it is and how important it is. I mean, we certainly as a society do not behave in a way that shows adequate respect for that. And I didn't have adequate respect for it, even though I'm from a family that includes educators. I think I had more respect than some other people, but not enough. What I want students to take away, I think my students would tell you, regardless of what I'm teaching, that they are really bored if the phrase gets complicated. And I really worry, I worry a lot. We seem to be living in an era where everybody wants hard and fast rules, and everybody wants black and white truths, and everybody wants, to kind of really, really delineate good from bad, vice from virtue, and assign, and put people in the categories of heroes and villains. And most people are much more complicated than that. Most situations are much more complicated. Most of life is 50 million shades of gray. And so I feel really humble about what I do and don't know. And I try to encourage that in my students. I try to really exhort them not to go to the first answer or not to go to the answer that just automatically dovetails with what they've decided their value structure is, but to look for nuance and complexity and to appreciate it.
What's their level of trust in news?
That's interesting you asked that, because I'm teaching a course this semester that is taught at Duke every semester. It's called The News as Moral Battleground, and it's sort of their media ethics course, but you can teach it in various ways. And the arc of my course, which I stole from which I borrowed in part from a previous professor's syllabus, is the decline of, we start with Watergate, and just how in the wake of the Pentagon Papers, in the wake of Watergate, the first thing I have my students do is watch the movies All the President's Men and The Post. How that was a high watermark for journalism, where if you look at surveys back then, the average American venerated journalists and journalism, and now we're like at a nadir. And the course explores how did we get from there to here. Their level of trust is too complete in the news organizations of their curation, and non-existent in the news organizations that they've identified as the enemy. And that's the problem. people say they distrust the media. People distrust the media that is not the media they've chosen to consume. And we have a real crisis because in a way that was not possible at all 20 years ago, and was less possible even 10 years ago, you can curate an information ecosystem for yourself that gives you the illusion of being broadly informed, and you are just in a rut. And that rut is deepening your pre-existing convictions and not challenging them, and that's a big agent, that's I think the major agent of partisanship today.
Walking in the woods for 2 hours a day is a long time for a person who has a life of ideas. And I'm wondering how, when you're out walking with Regan, do you hold on to those ideas until you can get back to writing?
I thought, usually, I thought we were going to go to ticks. Because almost always that sentiment, like I have, every time I mention in my newsletter walking in with it, like clockwork, I mention it in a newsletter, and I can count on 50 readers writing in and saying, but ticks. Which is so sweet, right? Because it's not, it's like, and I do want to know why we can give our dogs a pill that repels ticks, but there's nothing for us like that. And I fear it's because we're willing to visit the side effects on them, but not on us. Or,
Ivermectin.
So it's funny you ask that. I mean, there's a practical answer to your question, and then there's another answer. But I actually, because I do more of my reading by audiobook these days, than by kind of printed word. Many of those 2 hours are me listening to an audiobook. So, those 2 hour walks enabled me to get through Empire of Pain about the Sackler family, in a week, which it might have taken me that long to read it, in a conventional sense. I also much prefer talking to friends and relatives on the phone to texting them and emailing them. And so I use those 2 hours as phone time. Right, so that's like, I'm double tasking. But then the other thing is, when I'm not listening to an audiobook, when I'm not on the phone, I actually find if you're sitting, I'm curious if this is true for you as well, if you're sitting at a computer kind of trying to come up with sentences and thoughts, they come in a much more constipated fashion than if you are kind of out walking with, and I think there's something physiological to this. Your blood is flowing, there's a quickening of your heart rate. I find that my best ideas and best phrases come to me on those walks, and I'm able to hold on to most of them, but I've also been known to fire up a voice memo and actually speak them to myself and then transcribe them when I get home. So if I'm worried that I'm not going to remember it, I do that. So I feel like I get a lot accomplished on those walks. It sounds like the ultimate in indulgence and relaxation, and it is, but it's also like a period of fruitfulness.
Has your brain learned to process and hold on to audiobooks in a better way? I mean, because you can't make marginal notes, you can't do any of the things you would have been used to doing, especially with a dense book like a book.
No, I mean, totally. I mean, that's my Starfish experience. I was one of those people, and I'm betting a lot of you in the audience are this way, who I thought I was hopeless with audiobooks. Every time I tried to listen to an audiobook, like on a long car trip or for some other reason, my mind would wander. All of a sudden, I'd snap to it. It was an hour later, and it said I was on chapter 4, and I didn't even know what the main character's name was. I mean, I'm not exaggerating at all. And after this happened, I thought, I want to give audiobooks another shot because, again, first Kubler-Ross stage of melodrama, that may be all I'm left with, right? But I also just kind of thought, for a gazillion reasons, including that reading was becoming more difficult. And I had to try, but much more quickly than I thought. I mean, I now listen to my audiobooks on 1.6, 1.7. Judge Tatel listens to them on 2.0. That's my goal. And I can listen to something as complicated as Empire of Pain about the whole history of the Sackler dynasty, and I hold on to as much of it as if I were reading. Now, you can't make notes, and that's why my other preferred form is, and talk about being blessed. I mean, we live in an era where if you have low vision or vision impairment, I do a lot of reading on my iPad for 2 reasons. I can enlarge the font, and I can also control the lighting, which is hugely helpful if you've got any kind of vision impairment. But I do miss when I'm in the woods listening to an audiobook, the ability, to highlight a sentence I love, to bookmark a page, Yeah, that is one downside, but not much of a downside.
Excuse me. Have you found that your dog, Regan, reacts to you differently now that you've had the medical issues than he did before? Dogs are very empathetic.
If you can repeat the question, please.
I'll repeat it. The question, which I love reading questions, thank you. The question was whether do I notice that since this happened to me, or when I've been going through the worst parts of me, did I notice that Regan reacted differently to me in any way? I would love to say yes, because I do attribute almost preternatural powers to Regan. And I think dogs are more, not less intelligent than we give them credit for, even when we give them a lot of credit. I've never noticed it in this regard, but she also came along after both drug trials were over. So she never saw me injecting myself at the dining room table. But in other situations that are maybe half related to eyesight, I have noticed her exquisite empathy. I probably once a month, partly because I'm clumsy and always have been, but partly because my eyesight is not as acute, I will be kind of running lightly or walking quickly through Carolina North Forest, and my foot will hit a root, and I will go down hard. And maybe I'll make a sound, maybe not, but something about it is immediately identifiable to Regan, who, please don't get mad at me, may be off leash at that moment. And I am astonished that never happens without her circling back like lightning, and the next thing I know, she's licking my face. And I don't know all that's going on there, but something beautiful is going on there, and it makes me happy. And it takes my mind off the bruise.
Hi, we have a question in the center.
Hey there. I've been thinking about what you said about your teaching and about your students and about how they pick particular media that is what they believe in. And I'm just really curious what your prescription is for that. What do you recommend to your students? I think so many of us are parents or professors, and would love to hear your advice about that.
Well, first of all, that's true of students, but the students in that sense are just representative of most Americans. That's not unique to students at all, which is our problem, that it's so many of us. I recommend to them, I recommend to them that they actually pause and consciously assemble what I think they do understand would be a more ideal media diet. I think most of us fall reflexively and spontaneously into this sort of tribal media consumption. It's not that we go out and say, I only want to listen to Rachel Maddow and I only want to read the Think Progress newsletter. It just starts happening, and you never pause and say to yourself, have I stepped up to the buffet table of media and loaded my plate with broccoli only? And maybe I should go get some mashed potatoes and some of the chicken over there. I tell them to pause and think about what kind of informed person they want to be and how to construct that. And maybe to, I'm not telling you to go to Breitbart, and I would tell nobody to go to Breitbart, or One American News, but maybe sign up for a newsletter from the National Review. Do something like that. I also recommend there are a number of sites and kind of news entities whose mission is to give you an ideological spectrum. So I tell them to consider going to the Real Clear Politics website, which curates links twice a day that are from all over. They're deliberately distributed from right to left. I tell them to think about the publication, the online version of Publication of the Week, which has a gimmick where the first, not a gimmick, that's wrong, but its thing is when it is kind of reporting on, or doesn't really report on, when it's describing a news event, it's several paragraphs of just the facts, only the facts, and then it describes how these facts were analyzed and spun by different pundits of different ideological stripes, and gives you links you can click to follow them. So those are two. If you just did the Week and Real Clear Politics, you have essentially stepped up to the buffet table and made sure you have 10 different things on your plate rather than all meat or all vegetables.
here, and maybe one more over there.
Yep, 2 more questions.
Do you think that your students understand the importance of community newspapers to the health of communities?
Do I think my students understand the importance of community newspapers? Not fully, because how would they when they've grown up in an era when those papers are gone?
Because they have you to tell them.
Well, yeah, no, but so if you're asking me, do they understand it before we have a conversation about it? Some of them, but not many of them, because there's no way. Do the students in my News as a Moral Battleground class understand it now? Absolutely, because we have talked about it, because I had Margaret Sullivan, who is a media columnist for the Washington Post and an author of the recent and definitive book on the death of local journalism, because I had her Zoom in several weeks ago and make the case that I've also been making to students, make the case that all we lose when we lose community newspapers. When we talk about the various things that have fueled our red-hot degree of partisanship in this country, the death of local news is one of the things that's done that. And it's one of the things that has contributed to distrust in the media, because when you see the media as this national abstraction, as opposed to those hard-working men and women who are telling you what happened at the city hall meeting, at the community board meeting, you have a much different relationship with the news, and it's a less healthy, less respectful relationship with the news. So we do talk about that, but students who don't take a class that makes that part of the curriculum, I don't know how they possibly appreciate it when they've grown up without it. I do think, and I'm not the only person who says this, or the first person who says this, not the person who says it most eloquently, but I do think that's part of why we might want to think about teaching media literacy somewhere in the K through 12 education process, because I think we want to make this generation of young people aware of how to consume media, so they don't fall prey to wild conspiracy theories, and so they can distinguish between a legitimate source of information and an illegitimate source. But I also think we want them to appreciate what a healthy news ecosystem looks like, and a healthy news ecosystem includes local and community papers, local and community news organizations, websites, whatever.
You've given me an irresistible opportunity to plug a fantastic and relatively new local online news magazine focused on North Carolina called The Assembly. TheAssemblyNC.org, I believe, is the website. It's run by a young UNC graduate who's managed somehow to raise a lot of money and recruit some incredibly seasoned reporters to do really serious and very deliberately nonpartisan reporting on the most important issues in the state. So I urge you to check it out, The Assembly.
Thank you. You're absolutely right.
We'll do one more question over there. This is the last question.
Sure, go ahead.
Given your past reputation as a restaurant critic, what is your estimation of the restaurants in the area?
I mean, that's more of a no-win question than like Duke versus UNC. I believe the culinary offerings of this area are rich and varied. I do. No, I mean, listen, I think we all, I mean, since one of the themes of this evening is focusing on blessings and tallying blessings as opposed to slights and hardships, I think we all are blessed to live in an incredible area. I can think of few corners of the country, it's not a corner, but where you get this level of sophistication and cosmopolitan flavor with this many forest trails. No, I mean that. Our sort of like, this is some kind of sweet spot between cultural offerings and natural bounty. And included in those cultural offerings are a lot of great restaurants. And I cook more than I used to, just because that's where I am in my life. But I love many of the restaurants that I've been to and go to here. I adore Lantern, which is hardly a secret to anyone, but it deserves its wonderful reputation. I'm livid that Panchuto is not fully open again, and I can't figure out what's happening with Panchuto in Hillsborough, because that's a great place. And I don't know, if anyone knows what's going on with Panchuto, please bring us up to speed. I think this is a great area to eat out in. But I'm still like in my infant stages of eating out in this area. So I will defer to other people in the audience for wisdom on where best to eat.
And with that, dessert. We'll have Frank sign books. And thank you so much for both of you for coming out.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you.
And thanks again for coming out.